the Montana Territory, late fall 1889. The first frost had just blanketed Rattlesnake Gulch when old widow Harriet Bramwell, a widow who had lived alone for a full decade, began what her neighbors would later call the silliest project ever seen on the frontier. While other families focused on patching cabin roofs, reinforcing log walls, and rationing every bundle of dry firewood for the winter about to sweep down the valley, Harriet, with her silver hair tangled in the wind and her hands trembling with age, was doing something everyone believed was pointless. She was building a second wooden shell around her entire cabin, not an extension of the house, not a livestock barn, but a tall, enclosed wooden frame that created a hollow airspace between two walls, making it look like a giant box swallowing the small cabin inside. When asked why she was doing such a strange thing, Harriet gave no answer. She just kept measuring distances, sawing boards, and hammering nails, her breath turning into thin mist in the skin-cutting cold. The mockery started almost immediately. At Sunday gatherings, the men shook their heads. What does an old woman know about building? The women whispered that Harriet had lived alone too long and was no longer in her right mind. Even the children running past the cabin laughed. That shed won't even last through November winds. Some declared, Harriet's gone mad. The winter has driven her crazy. But the truth was, Harriet wasn't mad at all. She saw what everyone else had grown used to ignoring. The cold doesn't kill with temperature alone, but with piercing wind, damp walls, and firewood that burns without enough heat. That old woman whom the whole valley looked down on was trying an idea simple enough to be ridiculed, yet profound enough that, if it worked, it could change how the entire region survived Montana winters. What did an old widow understand about heat, moisture, and survival that the strong young people around her never noticed? Before I tell you the secret she relied on to challenge the harsh winter, do me a favor. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know where you're watching from. Do that, and I promise you'll learn a technique so simple it's hard to believe, yet so effective that even modern engineers are rediscovering its principle. Because what Harriet built wasn't the foolish whim of old age, it was the wisdom of a lifetime of observation. At Rattlesnake Gulch, Harriet Bramwell had lived beside her late husband Nathan Bramwell for more than 30 years, watching him treat every piece of wood as if it were the family's lifeline. Nathan had been a seasoned lumberman who understood every reaction of wood to moisture, cold, and frontier wind. He had shown Harriet how a board could breathe if placed in the right environment, how moisture creeping between planks could rot even the hardest wood in just a few winters, and how natural air circulation could mean the difference between a warm night and one numb with cold. When Nathan died, Harriet didn't just lose her life partner. She lost the main pair of working hands and the person who tended the fireplace every evening. Her first winter alone, she observed her own cabin with the same alarm Nathan had once warned about. The firewood was never truly dry. When burned, it hissed, smoked black, and sent damp vapor up to coat the cabin roof, and by midnight the room grew so stuffy she had to open the door in the freezing wind just to breathe. The cold was one thing, but the thick smoke from wet wood nearly made her faint one January night the previous year. She realized she wasn't shivering from Montana weather, she was shivering because the only fuel she had to fight it was betraying her. The cabins around her suffered the same problem. Firewood stacked outside under makeshift shelters, exposed to snow and wind for weeks, so even once dry wood absorbed enough moisture to cut its burning efficiency in half. The people in the valley only blamed the brutal winter. But Harriet knew better. The problem wasn't the cold wind, it was the wet firewood. The only thing that could keep her alive through the night, always left exposed to rain and snow. And in that desperation, she remembered an old sketch Nathan had once casually shown her, a system using the space between two layers of wood to keep materials dry and let the wood breathe. His words before he died suddenly became a life-saving truth. Dry wood means a warm night. Wet wood means a slow death. And so, in late fall 1889, as Harriet's cabin entered its 10th winter since her husband's death, she began the project her neighbors called the late-life folly of a lonely old woman. First, Harriet walked around her small log cabin 14 by 20 feet, examining every crack, every spot where cold air slipped in, as if measuring the house's own breath. Then, she set vertical posts 3 feet out from the cabin walls, in all 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. The posts were 8 feet tall. She dug them deep into the frozen ground with a shovel, each stroke trembling with age but no less resolute. Between the posts, she nailed horizontal boards, gradually forming a larger wooden frame that completely enclosed the real cabin like a second shell. From a distance, it looked like a crude box, but Harriet knew every measurement and angle was calculated from the knowledge Nathan had left her. On the third day, her neighbor Elmer Dobbins, a carpenter who had lived in the valley for 25 years, stopped by. "Harriet," he said, his tone like he was explaining something to a child, "you're wasting good lumber. That outer shell won't keep your cabin any warmer. Empty air doesn't help anything. You're just giving the wind more wall to steal heat from." Harriet didn't argue. She just kept hammering nails. "Maybe," she replied softly. "We'll see in January." But what she was building wasn't a makeshift shed, it was a natural environmental control system disguised as a simple wooden shell. The 3-foot gap between the cabin and the outer shell wasn't just empty space. It was the thermal buffer Nathan had described, where relatively still air would significantly reduce direct heat transfer from wind hitting the cabin walls. That alone would cut heat loss by about 30%. But Harriet did more. She designed the boards with intentional ventilation. Small gaps near the ground to draw cold air down, and high vents near the roof to let moisture escape. Air could move gently within the structure, but weather could not. Snow could pound the outer shell but never touch the cabin walls. Rain would fall on the roof that extended 3 feet out, then drop far from the real foundation, preventing water from seeping into the old wood structure. Harriet understood. As Nathan had said, water is wood's enemy, and keeping water away from the structure meant adding years to her own life. Inside that space, Harriet began stacking firewood systematically. She stood the logs upright, turning the cut ends outward for fastest moisture release, and used thin strips of wood to create 1-inch gaps between each log. Thanks to the outer shell blocking most windborne moisture and the ventilation allowing gentle air movement, in just 3 weeks, Harriet's firewood dried noticeably, something no cabin in the valley had ever achieved. Her wood felt dry to the touch. Her neighbor's was damp and sometimes slippery with frost. The physics were simple. Wood below 18% moisture burns bright and steady, while wood above 25%, the kind everyone else was using, burns weakly, gives off little heat, and produces heavy smoke, making cabins colder and more stifling. Harriet, with old knowledge and 6 days of elderly labor, was storing fuel 70% more efficient than the rest of the valley. But at the time, no one understood that. They only saw an old woman building a strange wooden layer around her cabin and thought age had driven her to foolishness. But as Harriet hammered the final boards of the wooden shell, the rumors began spreading throughout Rattlesnake Gulch. People saw the stooped old woman, silver hair loose in the wind, raising posts around her cabin, and the phrase "Old Harriet finally lost her mind" appeared everywhere. In the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, while waiting to weigh sugar at the general store, even at the little post office where gossip traveled faster than mail. No one really cared what she was doing. What mattered to them was that she was old, and old age on the frontier always meant weakness. No ability to contribute, no future worth investing in. The men accustomed to wielding hammers and saws shook their heads in front of Harriet's project, smiling with pity. Will that shed stand up to January north winds? The roof probably won't survive the first heavy snow. To them, an old widow stepping into men's territory construction was already wrong, but single-handedly building a structure larger than her own cabin went far beyond what they could accept. The village women whispered, "How can an old woman without a man's help build something like that?" Younger people showed pity. If only she'd listen and let someone fix her cabin. Old folks trying heavy work just invite trouble. Those words, though spoken gently, cut deeper than any wind blowing down from the mountains. Harriet heard them, every fragment of disdain, but she didn't stop. Each evening, as the sun disappeared behind the pine ridges, she sat at her small wooden table, carefully recording the cabin temperature, firewood moisture, and daily wind direction numbers no one else in the valley ever thought about. Harriet knew the crowd's laughter wouldn't keep her alive, but Nathan's knowledge could. The cold showed no mercy to the elderly, but it also made no age distinction when faced with correct understanding. And then, at the Sunday church service, the conflict reached its peak. The preacher, in his sermon to the community, made a heavy allusion to stubborn old folks wasting wood and strength on useless projects instead of letting experienced people guide them. In that moment, every eye in the small log building turned toward Harriet, layered looks of judgment, waiting to see how she would react. But Harriet didn't stand up, didn't defend herself, didn't offer a single explanation. She simply bowed her head quietly, clasping her hands to hide the trembling of age. When the service ended, she returned to her cabin and continued driving in the remaining nails because Harriet understood that some things only winter could answer, and she had lived long enough to know that silence is sometimes the strongest response. While the gossip still echoed through the valley, Harriet moved into the final phase of the system she had poured all her survival faith into. She began reinforcing the structure by nailing additional horizontal boards, creating wind-deflecting modules. Nathan had once called wind splitters planks that broke the force of strong gusts, reducing direct impact on the inner cabin. Over the lower vents, she added small overhanging boards to keep snow from blowing in during storms, a detail the young might overlook, but an old woman like her, who had endured nights when snow blew backward through the tiniest cracks, never took lightly. Since she lacked the strength to haul heavy timbers, Harriet chose lighter boards easy to handle, then braced them parallel with thin strips to prevent warping in high winds. She gathered flat stones from the creek, carried them back, and placed them under the post bases to prevent freeze-thaw water from rotting the wood from below, a simple yet refined technique few noticed. Every step bore the mark of age, slow, careful, and based on experience rather than strength. While she worked adjusting each board corner, passers-by still tossed mocking remarks. "You planning to live inside that box, Harriet? Or, one night of north wind will blow that shed away." Some even smiled with pity. "At your age, still thinking you can defy winter?" Those words made Harriet's chest tighten briefly. She wasn't made of stone and knew fear. She too had seen enough Montana winters to understand that one small miscalculation could mean freezing to death in the night, undiscovered for days. Sometimes Harriet stood motionless for minutes, hand resting on a post, listening to wind moving through the 3-foot space she had created. But instead of backing down, she tapped the post lightly, felt its solidity, and nodded to reassure herself. It will hold. She knew exactly what was at stake. If her calculations were wrong, this project would become a wooden coffin around her cabin. If right, it would be the first winter in 10 years she didn't shiver until dawn. The price of failure was her life. The reward of success was warmth. And on that narrow frontier, Harriet kept going. On the final day of building the shed, the early season wind began blowing harder, tearing through the eastern pine forest like a warning. Harriet, joints aching so much she had to pause repeatedly, raised the hammer to drive the last nail into the final board. Her hand shook, her breathing labored, but when the nail sank deep into the wood, the sharp clack rang out clean in the freezing air. It wasn't just the sound of a finished project, it was the quiet declaration of an old woman to winter, to age, and to the community that had doubted her. Alone and frail though she was, Harriet still chose to stand against the cold with her own trembling hands. But Harriet had barely caught her breath after driving in the last nail when the early season wind swept down Rattlesnake Gulch like a silent challenge. The wind shifted suddenly from the north, colder than any day before it, carrying thin moisture and the scent of ice from the distant mountains. The other cabins in the valley began emitting the familiar whistle of wind slipping through board gaps, a chilling sound that anyone who had lived long in Montana understood. Winter had knocked. The wind children ran hurriedly back to their cabin, clutching their coats as strong gusts pierced through cracks in the walls, while the Cole family had already started closing off their porch to fend off the sudden cold. Meanwhile, Harriet's shed reacted in a completely different way. Wind rushed into the bottom vents she had deliberately created, not slamming directly into the cabin as usual, but sliding down the 3-foot air layer between the two walls. The cold air flowed downward, slowed, then dispersed along the stone base she had laid, drawing moisture outward without reducing interior heat. Higher up, the roof vents holes many had told her she was drilling so the wind could blow the shed apart, proved their purpose. Light, warm air from inside the cabin naturally rose and escaped, preventing condensation on the wood, something Harriet had nearly paid for with a smoke-filled night the previous year. In that freezing silence, The old woman stood alone in her small yard, sensing the changing airflow through every void she had built with her own trembling hands. She stepped into the cabin, lit the fireplace, and began recording. When the thermometer read 47 degrees Fahrenheit, Harriet paused. The year before, at the same time, her cabin had been only 35 degrees Fahrenheit despite an early fire. A 12-degree difference might seem small to the young, but for an elder facing a long winter, 12 degrees could be the line between aching joints and easy breathing, between shivering awake all night and sleeping peacefully until morning. After 10 days, Harriet checked the firewood. When her bony hand touched the log surface, she noticed the subtle change. The wood was dry, light, without the usual cold, damp layer. Just 10 days in the newly built shed, and the firewood had significantly reduced moisture, something the entire valley had never seen. But when she stepped outside, the whispers awaited her as usual. "That was just a mild wind," one man said, while peering through the shed boards. "Wait until January. When the real north wind hits, that shed will be gone." Another woman added, "Nothing proves her system will hold. It's only early season, who knows yet." Those words still tugged at Harriet's heart a little, but unlike before, she no longer flinched. She just looked up at the boards that had faced their first wind test, then nodded slightly. The early season wind was only a greeting, not the real battle. Harriet had lived through too many winters to know the true test hadn't arrived yet, because in Montana, everything truly begins when January sweeps in with cold no one in the valley was ever fully ready to face. Harriet knew the real challenge was coming on a late December afternoon when the Montana sky suddenly turned a thick lead gray, a color only those who had lived their whole lives on the frontier could read the meaning of. She looked up, her old eyes dim but her instinct sharper than any young person in the valley. "A big storm is coming," she told Elmer Dobbins as he passed by. But Elmer just laughed, replying with the teasing remark Harriet had heard for 20 years. "You say that every year." The others paid no mind. They thought the old woman was worrying needlessly, as always. But this time, Harriet sensed something different. The wind fell unnaturally still. No longer the whisper of the pine forest, no longer the late-season birds, only a heavy silence, as if nature were holding its breath. And then, like a cold blade plunging into the valley, the temperature dropped sharply within hours. The ground hardened so fast that Harriet's first steps into the yard cracked the thin ice with sharp snaps. The wind suddenly rose, not the gentle early-season gusts, but ferocious blasts reaching 60 miles per hour, whipping snow into towering white columns. In just one evening, the wind grew so strong that people in Pine Ridge had to crawl to get inside because standing was impossible, gusts slamming into faces, chests, and shoulders like blows that staggered even the strongest men. And then the real disaster began. Firewood stacks left outside, only loosely covered with tarps or slanted roofs, froze solid in hours. Ice encased each log like armor, making them impossible to burn. People tried shoving the wood into stoves, but instead of flames roaring up, there was only the hiss of steam, followed by thick smoke pouring from stove mouths. The coal house was the first to suffer. Black smoke filled the cabin, forcing Mr. Cole to open windows in the freezing wind to avoid suffocating, making the cabin even colder. The Parker place was worse. They burned wet wood until smoke coated the ceiling, the stench so strong it brought tears. The two Wind children coughed until their lips turned blue because the stove wasn't hot enough to burn off the moisture in the wood. The elderly in the valley shivered violently, sometimes curling up in bed as cold seeped through every board gap they couldn't counter with dry firewood. While the entire valley sank into darkness and knife-sharp cold, Harriet's cabin was a rare point of light. The shed took the full force of wind and snow like protective armor, leaving the inner cabin almost untouched by the storm's destruction. Wind could batter the outer shell until it rattled, but inside there was only the crackle of steady burning fire. The thermometer in the cabin read 65 degrees Fahrenheit, a warmth Harriet hadn't seen at this time of year in the past 10. For 48 hours as the storm raged, her cabin maintained stable heat. No smoke, no dampness, no wind piercing to the bone. All because the firewood stacked in her shed was down to 13–15% moisture, just right to burn bright, strong, and clean. The fire in Harriet's stove didn't struggle like her neighbors. It burned evenly, steadily, each new log catching instantly. In the golden warmth of the flames, Harriet sat in her old wooden chair, Her bony hands held close to the fire to feel the heat envelop her wrinkled skin. She sighed, not from exhaustion, but as if an invisible burden of months had finally been set down. "Nathan, I got it right today," she whispered, her voice trembling but full of gratitude. Outside, the storm still howled, as if trying to tear everything apart, but in that small cabin, the bright fire reflected in her aged eyes, proof that persistence and simple knowledge could sometimes be stronger than Montana winter itself. But while Harriet sat quietly by that steady fire, the rest of Rattlesnake Gulch sank deeper into a night of desperation. The Wynn family was the first to run out of hope. Their firewood stack beyond any shed cover was encased in thick ice, and every piece fed into the stove produced more smoke than heat. The two children shivered uncontrollably under blankets, their breath hot and ragged, coughing heavily as cold seeped into their lungs. Their parents held them helplessly, knowing that without dry wood, the family wouldn't last until morning. A few hundred yards away, the Coles were in even graver danger. They had tried burning their remaining wood, wet enough that water dripped onto the floor, and smoke so thick it coated the cabin ceiling. Mr. Cole, struggling to keep the fire going for his wife, passed out from smoke right beside the stove. When Mrs. Cole dragged him near the window for air, she could only cry in the bone-chilling cold advancing deeper into the cabin. That night, amid wind whistling through every board gap, the hope of both families and many others in the valley focused on one place. They had once laughed at Harriet, whispered she was mad, called her shed a meaningless box, but now shame no longer mattered. Survival did. So, in the freezing wind and snow stinging like needles, they struggled step by step to Harriet's small cabin. Mrs. Cole knocked first, the weak taps in the storm like an unspoken plea she hardly dared name. Harriet opened the door, and in that instant both women froze. From the narrow opening, a golden, warm air flowed out, in complete contrast to the skin-cutting cold outside. It was like a door into another world, not the world of blizzard, but of life. When they stepped inside, they stood silent. No smoke, no dampness, no whistling wind through boards. Only gentle warmth from the stove and the smell of dry wood burning steadily. That astonishment left even the greatest skeptics speechless. They asked Harriet to show them the shed, the thing they had mocked for weeks, and when she led them outside, they could hardly believe their eyes. Snow piled thick on the outer shell, but the shed stood firm, unmoved. The boards they had once sneered at were now the valley's most effective storm barrier. They touched the logs Harriet had stacked in the 3-foot spacelight, dry logs that rang crisp when struck, truly ready to burn. No dampness, no mold, no ice coating the surface, something no other cabin had achieved during the storm. Eyes changed in that moment, from doubt to amazement, from mockery to acknowledgement, from disdain to respect. And then Harriet, with her tangled silver hair and patched shawl, said only one sentence, light as wind yet heavy as stone dropping into their hearts. Dry wood isn't a miracle, it's preparation. No one replied. No one dared laugh as before, because in that negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit cold, the preparation of an old woman they had once dismissed was what was keeping them alive. But when the storm cleared, when the wind faded to weary howls along the slopes, and the first morning light pierced the silver-gray clouds, Rattlesnake Gulch faced the harsh truth the blizzard had left behind. 7 cabins had partial roof damage. Places where wind had ripped away boards, even the strongest men in the area could barely lift. 5 families opened their wood stores to find only solid white ice, once damp logs, now hard as rock, unsplittable, unburnable, useless for warmth. Damp smoke from nights of burning wet wood left young children coughing relentlessly, the sound echoing in the morning cold like a nameless fear. One family nearly lost a member when the stove went out in the night, cold flooding the cabin so fast rescue came within inches. Across the valley were images of people slumped in exhaustion, faces pale from lack of sleep, cold, and panic that had lasted 3 unrelenting days. Amid the chaos, only one place stood intact: Harriet's cabin. Her shed was the only structure undamaged, untwisted, unbroken. The inner cabin still held its golden warmth, and the dry firewood store in the 3-foot space was nearly untouched. More than that, Harriet, with her stooped frame and trembling hands, became the lifeline the entire community clung to. She opened the shed door, sharing bundles of dry wood with the winds to warm the two children still shivering under blankets. She brought hot porridge to Mrs. Cole, who had endured 3 nights of breathless fear. She split small pieces for the Parkers to relight their dead stove. Each act was quiet, uncalculated, as simple as the warmth radiating from the fire she had preserved through the storm. When they took the wood, no one called her shed crazy anymore. No one mentioned the mad old woman. They looked at the wooden structure around Harriet's cabin and saw not a mistake but a survival system based on physics principles they had never understood. A project they had once ridiculed was now proof of one woman's deep understanding of nature, a woman they had undervalued. They began to realize the shed wasn't the stubbornness of an old lady. The shed was knowledge, experience, the ability to read wind, understand moisture, converse with winter in the language of small but precise things, airspace, warmth, humidity, airflow. And when Harriet returned to her cabin after the morning of helping each household, a strange silence spread through the community. Those who had mocked her at the blacksmith, at church gatherings, now avoided her eyes, not from simple shame but from the realization they had misjudged the woman they thought time had left behind. A quiet but clear reversal of standing. The elder they had dismissed was now the only one who truly understood the harsh winter they all feared. And in the storm's aftermath of destruction, Harriet, through her cabin surrounding shed, had become the symbol of what the valley should have known long ago. Survival doesn't come from strength. It comes from preparation. The next morning, as the storm's final clouds dissipated and pale sunlight shone on the thick snow blanketing the valley, a man in a fur hat rode into Rattlesnake Gulch Marshall Penn, a seasoned stove expert with over 25 years handling cold-damaged, damp, and smoke-filled cabins. He had been summoned because the community needed a clear explanation. Why Harriet's cabin had survived so easily while so many others faced disaster. Marshall walked each damaged cabin first, taking measurements, noting, shaking his head at torn roofs, cracked boards, frozen wood. But at Harriet's cabin, he lingered far longer. He touched the shed shell, tapped the support posts lightly, walked around checking frame stability, then asked to measure temperatures inside the cabin and in the space between walls. The results left the group following him silent enough to hear his pencil scratching the notebook. Harriet's cabin had held 61 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the storm, nearly 20 degrees warmer than the Rattlesnake Gulch average. The coal cabin, where the owner had passed out from damp smoke, reached only 41 degrees Fahrenheit despite burning nearly twice the wood. Marshall moved to the firewood. He used a small scale, knife, and simple but accurate moisture meter. The numbers appeared like a scientific verdict. Harriet's wood at 13 to 15% moisture, the level of perfectly seasoned fuel. Other families ranged 28-36%. Many logs moldy or ice-saturated so that splitting them sent water running down hands. After measuring Harriet's wood consumption barely half the valley average, Marshall stood quiet for a long while, as if organizing every result in his mind. Then he explained to the gathered community, his voice low and solid like heavy timber hitting the floor. The 3-foot dead air layer Harriet had built around the cabin reduced heat loss by about 35%. It acted as a buffer, preventing heat flow from the cabin directly through boards to the negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside. But that was only the beginning. More important was the 2-level ventilation system she arranged. Bottom vents drawing cold air low, forcing moisture out instead of letting it settle. Roof vents pulling warm, moist air upward in a natural loop, creating what modern engineers call passive convection. Her shed was essentially functioning as a modern rain screen, a system separating outer cladding from the true wall, keeping the inner structure dry, free of condensation, buildup, rot, or reverse cold penetration. Marshall bent down, picked up a log from the shed, flicked it lightly. The crisp ring showed ideal dryness, and he explained why it mattered. With wet wood, most fire energy goes to boiling and evaporating hidden water in the grain. Only after the water is gone does the wood truly burn. Meaning, wet wood isn't just weak, it wastes stove efficiency, produces heavy smoke, leaves cabins colder and more prone to suffocation. In Harriet's shed, moisture was continuously controlled by the microclimate chamber created by the airspace, gentle airflow, and isolation from direct snow, rain, and wind. These 3 factors kept her wood dry according to basic physics. Slow-moving air let the wood breathe. Moisture was drawn to roof vents. Snow couldn't touch the logs, and the inner cabin was shielded from extreme weather. After presenting all measurements, Marshall looked up at the unusually silent crowd around him. He placed a hand on Harriet's shed post and spoke slowly, clearly, as if wanting everyone to remember forever. What this old widow built is environmental control engineering, hidden in plain boards. No one laughed. No one argued. Those who had sneered, mocked, called her mad now stood still, only able to look at Harriet with respect they had never shown anyone in the valley. Because for the first time, they understood. Harriet had won, not with words, not with strength, but with facts, knowledge, and preparation they had all lacked. And from the moment Marshall Penn confirmed the value of Harriet's system, a quiet but profound wave of change spread across Rattlesnake Gulch. In the next 2 springs, not 1 or 2 but 19 families built their own surrounding sheds, every post and board following the calm, unboastful instructions Harriet shared. Those who had once mocked her now stood beside her, asking how to place bottom vents, how to measure the 3-foot gap, which way to stack logs for fastest moisture release. She guided each one slowly and clearly, as if this were the final task she needed to complete for the valley that had once turned its back on her. By 1892, the technique had spread beyond the valley. The Montana Seasonal Survival Bulletin, the county's official survival newsletter, recognized Harriet's shed model as an optimal solution for cold mountain homesteads. They gave it a name Harriet never imagined would be tied to her: Bramwell Winter Shell System. Geological surveyors from Helena and Bozeman came to see the original structure. They took notes, drew sketches, and concluded that Harriet's shed was a primitive but highly effective form of ventilated facade, a concept only formally named decades later. They said Mrs. Bramwell, a widow living alone, had been half a century ahead of science in energy efficiency. As years passed, winters came and went. Cabins built to her model still stood strong. 40 years after that historic storm, homes with the Bramwell shell still had unrotted roofs, unwarped walls, and dry firewood through every snowfall. Families living in them always told the story of an old woman stubbornly raising posts in the wind, ridiculed but unshaken. And then in 1903, Harriet Bramwell passed away in her sleep, peacefully, as the small fire that had accompanied her all her life. When neighbors entered the cabin to say goodbye, they found her lying in bed, face serene, a faint warmth still radiating from the stove-burning logs she herself had prepared weeks before. On her grave, they carved no long biography, no mention of the storm, the mockery, or the triumph. They left only a short phrase that captured Harriet's entire life. She kept the fire dry. The story of Mrs. Bramwell isn't just a survival anecdote. It became a simple yet profound philosophy of the American frontier, that sometimes the most ridiculed person understands nature best, that knowledge doesn't always live in books, but in observation, persistence, and faith in simple things, that not every hero is young, strong, or celebrated. Some heroes quietly protect warmth for themselves and for a community that spent a lifetime underestimating them. And in the story's final scene, as early season snow falls lightly on the old shed roof, golden light from the cabin spills through the gray-blue night, we realize what Harriet left behind isn't just a technique, but an eternal reminder that preparation, understanding, and courage can sometimes be enough to change an entire small valley on the map of America. If you love simple yet wise survival stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.